Shavua Tov, everybody. Great to see everybody. Thanks for bearing with our um, schedule change to Tuesday night this week. And here we are in Parashat Vaera. Uh, no midrashim in this one, really a um, close, close-ish reading of set of psukim in the parasha. Certainly, um, a sense of trying to draw out a theme. Um, that Rabbi Avital Hachstein is doing. And if time permits, for those who are readers of the Lair House, just today, a new essay was published, which very, very much tied to the theme of our essay on the Parsha. So maybe we'll have a chance to look at that as a companion piece if time permits. Let me share my screen. Okay, this essay is called On the Value of Stubbornness. There were a couple of spots where, and I haven't checked about this question of the Hebrew and the English, but there were a couple of spots where the English didn't feel as smooth. I do have the Hebrew here as well, if necessary, to switch over to it and see if we can get any clarity where needed. My hunch is that these were originally written in Hebrew. I'm not sure if Rabbi Avital Hachstein herself wrote the English translation also, or if someone else did. I'm not sure. I'll see if I can find that out. So this is called On the Value of Stubbornness from Parashat Vaera 57:77. Stubbornness is a complex and harsh characteristic. It is no surprise then that Paro, who is considered to be one of the most wicked characters in the Torah, and last week, for those who had a chance, we saw her take on when evil is driven by fear, and he was a key player in that. So Paro, who is considered to be one of the most wicked characters in the Torah, is shown as being very stubborn. We see Paro repeatedly refusing to engage with the reality that he is faced with, and stubbornly, over and over, refusing to send the Israelites out of Egypt. Paro is the paradigmatic, stubborn person in the Exodus story. Yet Parashat Vaera also points to other characters in the story who are not considered wicked in any way, who are nevertheless portrayed with this characteristic of stubbornness. This implies that perhaps stubbornness is not all bad. What can we learn about this character trait from our parasha, and when might it make sense to employ it? So if here, or I should say this way, if last week she was presenting to us kind of the way fear drives evil, and the way fear-driven evil sometimes comes back to kind of harm its very own perpetrators, in that midrash that we read, in which the Midrash understands that perhaps even Egyptian babies were being thrown into the Nile. And then she used that to kind of ask the question, when do we ourselves sometimes become evil when driven by our own fear? And how do we stand up against that? Um, so here she's taking the kind of stubbornness characteristic of Paro and asking, is stubbornness always bad? Or can we see stubbornness in a broader light, and where might that be employed? We'll start with Paro, the paradigm of stubbornness. Over and over, we see him refusing to yield, to listen to Moshe and Aharon's pleading. As the text says, Paro's heart stiffened, and he did not heed them. He appears equally stubborn in the conversations between God and Moshe. And God said to Moshe, Paro is stubborn, he refuses to let the people go. And in his response to the first plague, Paro turned and went into his palace, paying no regard even to this. Again and again. Paro's stubbornness, at least at a particular stage, is portrayed as having been almost thrust or forced upon him. God says as much to Moshe, but I will harden Paro's heart, and he will not heed you. While probably for most of us, it's this issue, and we saw Rav Shai held on this, I believe, of kind of we focus on the distinction between Paro hardening his own heart and God hardening Paro's heart. That's less interesting to Rav Avital. She's more focused on the quality of this stubbornness itself more than its source. She notices, okay, at some point it seems even like Paro is not even the agent of his own stubbornness, but that's less interesting to her than just kind of delving into this stubbornness itself. And indeed, as events are taking place and described, it appears that God is actively strengthening or hardening Paro's heart. God stiffened the heart of Paro, and he would not heed them, just as God had told Moshe. This strengthens our resolve to discover what this stubbornness is really about, why it is so critical, and what role it plays in the story, right? If God is actually actively engaging in in creating Paro's stubbornness, it must be somehow central and essential. Let's understand it better. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch suggests that this stubbornness or hardening that Paro experiences can be divided into three types, based on the language that the Torah uses to describe it. I will harden. Regarding this, we find three types. I will strengthen, I will make heavy, and I will harden. Just we switch over for a moment to the Hebrew, we can see here it doesn't quite emerge as clearly in the way it's formatted in the English. She's already quoting here now from a comment of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, Rav Hirsch's comments on the Parashah, on Shmot chapter 7, verse 3, really kind of the beginning of the story of hardening. And Rav Hirsch on Aksheh, I will harden, says in this regard, we find three different kind of flavors or dimensions or variations of hardening. Achazek, Achabed, and Aksheh. And now Rav Hirsch is going to try to differentiate, as he's wont to do with Hebrew roots and their nuances, between these three different things: Kasheh, Kaved, and Chazak. Tough or hard, heavy, and strong. Go back to the English. Hard, heavy, and strong. Hard means being rigid, without registering any influences, without being influenced by anything that passes us, that kind of flows by us or um, impacts us. Then there's heavy, being a person of weight, able to be influenced, but with a significant gap between the actual impression and the willingness to act based on it. Sluggish. Again, hard to imagine that that's exactly the right translation. Kaved tnu'ah is like, yeah, sluggish. It's sort of slow moving, maybe a little bit more descriptive. And then there's strong, achazek, steadfast, fully opposing to submit, despite a full recognition, totally obliterating the influence. Now she's going to, describe these a little bit more. So Rav Hirsch describes three different forms of this attribute that she's calling stubbornness, and how it manifests itself in Paro. Three forms which are similar, but not identical. The first is characterized by rigidity. That is characterized itself by an ignoring of the environment, a rigidity that blocks any outside influences. This kind of behavior can be seen when Paro is completely unimpressed and unmoved by Moshe's pleading, the suffering of Israel, or even the plagues that affected him and his people directly. It's a kind of imperviousness or impenetrability, where what's happening around you makes no impact on you whatsoever. It's again, that's from Kasheh, sort of a toughness, again, imperviousness. The second is characterized by heaviness. This heaviness is not about ignoring. Someone whose heart is heavy can absorb information from his surroundings, but this is insufficient to influence him, to get him to act upon those potential influences. They don't propel him to act in the direction where the information points. This phenomenon is evident in the way Paro reacts to the second plague of frogs. The plague is described in all of its gross and gory details. If you refuse to let them go, I will plague your whole country with frogs. The Nile shall swarm with frogs, and they shall come up and enter your palace, your bedchamber, and your bed. Beitecha, v'chadar mishkavcha, v'al mitatecha, houses of your courtiers and your people, your ovens and your kneading bowls. And then later on, then the frogs died out in the houses, courtyards, and the fields. They piled them up in heaps until the land stank. Vativash haaretz. Despite this horrifying scene, Paro is unfazed. But when Paro saw that there was relief, he became stubborn. Just say the Hebrew there. Vayar Paro ki hayta revacha v'hachbeid et libo. He's not moved to eject the Israelites from Egypt. Instead, he is weighed down, perhaps willfully, and unmoved. It's impossible to say that Paro doesn't experience, he's not impervious to the frogs. He experiences the frogs. He's, sensorily and otherwise really has the experience of the frogs, but he doesn't allow it to change his attitude. Lastly, Paro exhibits strength. This is a chazek. According to Rav Hirsch, behavior that's defined by strength is self-aware and defiant. The lack of change in it is not defined by being weighed down or passive inertia, but rather an active refusal to be moved. He is aware that he doesn't want to move or change because these actions are perceived by him as giving in. For example, during the third plague of lice, kinim. Then God said to Moshe, say to Aaron, hold out your rod and strike the dust of the earth, and it shall turn to lice throughout the land of Egypt. The magicians did the like with their spells to produce lice, but they could not. The magician said to Paro, Etzba Elohim he, this is the finger of God. But Paro's heart stiffened, and he would not heed them. Even when Paro's people tell him explicitly that they are all witnessing the finger of a mighty God, and that all Paro needs to do to resolve the situation is to let the people go, Paro digs in his heels and will not give up and will not give in. Paro is not alone in his stubbornness. Okay, so that's we should pause for a moment here. So these are the three variations on stubbornness that Rav Hirsch describes. I haven't seen the rest. I didn't see the rest of Rav Hirsch to see whether this mapping out onto these examples of the plagues is Rav Hirsch's or if this is Rav Avital's. But either way, we have these three, which I think, resonate to a degree in our own experiences. There are times where we just close ourselves off to even hearing something. That's sort of the first. The second is some degree of experiencing, but not allowing ourselves to be impacted. And then the third is somehow it's like you're experiencing it. It gets inside you, and you sort of know what the right thing to do is almost, but you just defiantly reject it, even though you kind of feel it within you, I guess is the way I would differentiate between the second and third. It's subtle. Again, it's a Rav Hirschian kinds of distinctions, but they resonate, I think, maybe in our lived experiences a little bit of different kinds of stubbornness. But now she goes on to expand the perspective here. Paro is not alone in his stubbornness, in his unwillingness to accept that the slavery is ending and the exodus is imminent. Even without a divine hardening of their hearts, the Israelites also show a stubbornness. Now, last time, in last week's essay, she compared Paro's fear to the midwife's kind of fear, Paro being afraid of the Israelites, and the midwives revering God, Vayiru ata Elohim. And in the case of Paro, the word fear never appeared. It was just implicit in Paro's kind of description, what's going to happen if these people become too numerous and they'll fight us and rise up. But with the midwives, the language was explicit. So to here, she's trying to draw out a comparison where I think in one case it's very, very explicit, and in the other it's subtle. Paro's stubbornness is explicit. Now she wants to try to argue that the Israelites in their own way are also being stubborn. The same language doesn't appear, but there are hints to it that enable her to make this case. Even without a divine hardening of their hearts, The Israelites also show a stubbornness. It says about Paro, he didn't heed, and it also says about the Israelites, they didn't heed. Here comparing, uh, right? It says about Paro, velo shama, and about Bnei Israel, velo shama'u. So there is a textual hook that she's building herself on, not language of stubbornness in both cases, but a not heeding in each case. And Paro's not heeding is, we know, because of his hardened heart, because of his stubbornness. She wants to now build the idea that there's a stubbornness at play for the Israelites as well. Even though it seems that Paro and the Israelites are exhibiting the same behavior, they are both stubborn in refusing to accept the reality that God is going to redeem the Israelites through Moshe's leadership. The context for their behavior is quite different, almost opposite. Paro is holding on to the Israelites and enslaving them. He's insisting on a continuation of the suffering and back-breaking labor which he initiated. The Israelites, on the other hand, are described as refusing to listen because they themselves are suffering, their spirits crushed by cruel bondage. Paro is mired in a lack of morality. Israel is mired in a lack of faith. What they have in common is that they refuse to accept what seem like the futile fantasies of Moshe about the Israelites leaving Egypt with him, moving from bondage to freedom. Okay, so there's a thesis here that's worth really considering. Again, Paro's stubbornness is obvious and apparent. For Bnei Israel, we sort of just look at it as they were enslaved, they were suffering, they were struggling so much from the backbreaking labor that they couldn't possibly hear, Moshe's message of deliverance. We wouldn't typically call that stubbornness, but she, I think, wants us to expand the notion of stubbornness to just in unwillingness or inability to hear a message which is in front of you, that's worth kind of um, interrogating and understanding. Go on a little further. Paro is mired in a lack of morality. Israel is mired in a lack of faith. What they have in common is that they refuse to accept what seem like the futile fantasies of Moshe about the Israelites leaving Egypt with him, moving from bondage to freedom. Israel needs to be convinced that this idea of the Exodus, of actually leaving Egypt, is real, implementable, and viable. They need to believe in it. While deep in the heart of slavery, it's hard for the Israelites to imagine a different reality. Their insistence on relying on the here and now, as opposed to a promise for the future, stems from despair. How much hope are they supposed to keep? Paro also refuses to accept the future as described by Moshe, and in that way, his stubbornness in all its strength, weight, and difficulty, those were our three key terms now in reverse order, achazek, achabed, and akshe, is close to the Israelites' despair. Paro refuses to see what the Israelites cannot. Now we come to the kind of third way or third character. In contrast to both of these images of stubbornness, Paro's refusal and the Israelites' despair, there is a third image. This third character needs to be even more stubborn, strong, and resolute. This character is God. God's stubbornness is characterized by steadfastness, insistence, and resoluteness in the face of those who don't believe in God's presence and God's promise. God needs to stand against those who refuse him, who repeatedly reject the vision of the future that God presents. At the very beginning of the story, God promises Moshe, Vaydaber Elohim el Moshe. This is now we're back to the very beginning of our Parashah. God spoke to Moshe and said, I appeared Vaera, I appeared to Abraham, etc., etc. I remembered my covenant, so say to the Israelite people, I am God. And we have the languages of redemption here. I will free you, deliver you, redeem you, take you, and bring you into the land. A few verses later, God speaks to Moshe again. Go and tell Paro, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites depart from his land. God is always responded to with negativity and refusal. this coming from Moshe, the Israelites would not listen to me. How then should Paro heed me? But God continues with God's own steady perseverance. So God spoke to both Moshe and Aaron in regard to the Israelites and Paro, king of Egypt, instructing them to deliver the Israelites from the land of Egypt. And I think this pasuk, to me, from the beginning of the parashah, go to it for a moment, if we can. Right, so we have kind of Moshe first. First, it's the Israelite kind of inability to hear the message of redemption. Again, this is coming on the heels of the end of last week's parsha, where Moshe goes to Paro and Paro makes everything worse, and the Israelites get upset. And Moshe turns back around to God and says, "This is, completely the opposite of the direction you told me things were going to be going in." And God goes back to Moshe and says, it is going to happen. Go tell Paro to let the Israelites depart. And Moshe says this, sort of key term, and I think again, this could be the starting point for this exploration of the stubbornness, because here we have the two resistances side by side. Hein b'nei Yisrael lo shamu elai ve'ech yishma'eni Paro. The Israelites would not listen to me. How could Paro then listen to me? And then we have this kind of the insistent God against both of the resistant listeners or non-listeners. So God spoke to Moshe and Aaron, "Vayitzaveim el bnei Yisrael v'al Paro melech Mitzrayim," regarding the Israelites and Paro, "Lotzi et bnei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim," to take the Israelites out of the land of Egypt, with the sense being both of them need convincing about the Exodus, both Paro and the Israelites. So I think from the beginning of the parasha, even though we've only circled back around to it here, kind of lays the seeds for the notion of what she's pointing out, that Paro and Bnei Israel are kind of lined up side by side in the same situation. It's needing God's insistent and persistent convincing through the vehicle of Moshe that the Exodus is going to happen. God's stubbornness is instructive and holds a lesson for all of us who dream of a world that looks different than the one we now inhabit. Maybe anyone who dreams about a different reality, anyone who believes that it is truly possible that our existence can be transformed, needs a form of stubbornness. They all need to be unrelenting and steadfast in holding on to their dreams, rejecting the people who resist change on the one hand, and who are too beaten down to have faith on the other. God's character in the story emerges for the benefit of dreamers, to call us to be constant and steadfast in our faith that indeed tomorrow can be different. And if we are not dreamers, but rather are those who listen, God's voice is charging us to bear the difficulty, the heaviness, the strength of those who are dreamers. By the way, feels like a parallel to the end of her previous essay, where she sort of said, if you're not going to be one of the midwives, if we don't have the strength to actually stand up and fight back, we can at least be the people who, amplify the voices of those who are doing that. And here too, she's sort of ending and saying, okay, there's different roles for us. If we're not the leaders who are going to be the stubborn change makers, we can be those who listen to the change makers, bearing the difficulty, heaviness, and strength. Again, these three terms of those who are dreamers. Because it is in the merit of those divine representatives, such as Moshe and Aaron, that we become brazen enough to imagine what a life beyond slavery would look like, to see it and even live it. So this is the take. This is, I think, a nice insight from the parasha, and developing. I think it flows from the beginning of the parasha, where we see Bnei Israel and Paro lined up side by side as those that through Moshe and Aaron, God needs to convince that the Exodus is really happening. With Paro, we have much more explicit language of his resistance and his stubbornness. With Bnei Israel, it's simply the fact that they're in their exhaustion and suffering, they're unable to hear, but still in the same, the outcome is ultimately the same, that both of them need convincing, and that convincing needs to come from, or through the, mouthpieces, Moshe and Aaron, of a being who is equally, if not more, stubbornly persistent in, articulating the message. And I think my initial just the thought, and then open it up, is kind of the when we think about change, here this is I think a an activist type of interpretation here, and it circles back to what is necessary to make change. And the flip side of the strength and persistence and not allowing detractors or anything like that to veer you off course is sometimes, leaders in that sense can be too rigid and maybe not be able to be relatable to the people if you're simply just, you know, saying this is happening, we got to do this, we got to do this. Um, is there any place to meet people in the middle is what I guess I'm wondering reading this kind of call for impervious, tough, change agency. Obviously the willingness to push forward almost no matter what is an essential characteristic or quality of leadership. But maybe there's some softer side that's kind of being left out in this analysis that I wonder about. Um, so again, we're seeing here an approach that tries to extract a theme, from the story of the Parsha, take it up to a kind of higher analytical level, and then apply it to today. And happy to hear thoughts and reactions. Convinced? Is a fair reading to call Bnei Israel kind of stubbornly unable to hear? Could we have expected anything different from them? Is it are they comparable enough, or are they just totally different circumstances?
I think it's difficult to call a person or a group of people suffering as stubborn.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like they have other priorities, or they're on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They're not able to get past, basic needs to think about future explorations or
Mm-hmm.
dreams or
Mm-hmm.
or adventures and fantasies. When they're worried about food, shelter, and water.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't feel like stubbornness to me, as opposed to like just bandwidth.
Stuckness or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. I think there's something in that in the comparison which doesn't quite feel fair. Um, again, at some level, there is a parallel that both need convincing and need drawing out. Um, and I guess that question for a leader is, if you see people who feel that they're in such a difficult place that they're not able to hear your message, is there a way to reach them? Do you have to tend to their needs first, or is there somehow a way to reach them where they're at, um, and kind of transcend their challenged circumstances? Like I guess in the moment that we're in, where these parshiot kind of meet us around MLK Day, um, I guess thinking about Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership, some of it was somehow taking a people that was struggling and suffering and empowering them in some way to be, again, this is a very broad, generalized reading, but some of it was sort of empowering people to be agents of their own redemption in a way that doesn't happen at all in this story, right? God just, you know, there is, I guess, at the end in the Korban Pesach, ultimately they had to believe enough to be willing to take some step. But mostly they're still just so beaten down that they can't do very much of anything. Um, Obviously, the circumstances are not identical, but MLK in some way was able to take people who were still struggling and oppressed and, get enough buy-in and help them see enough of what was possible that they could participate in a more active way than the Israelites were able to. Again, there may not be exactly the same circumstances, but there's some parallel comes to mind and, instructive way of thinking about them. Yeah.
the phrase is ruach that's used in this parsha.
Kotzer, yeah, kotzer ruach,
Kotze
short,
ruach.
short spiritedness or something like that, and
Yeah,
avodah hasha, right?
yeah, it just doesn't strike me as referring to their stubbornness.
Yeah, yeah. It's a, again, it's a creative read. It's a the term, I guess, in part what I think she's trying to do with Rav Hirsch is to sort of say, you know, stubbornness isn't exactly doesn't capture it all. There's these different kinds of conditions, um, and maybe even the first one, the rigidity, is kind of like the inability to even hear anything different than what your current condition is. That's not stubbornness, that's kind of rigidity. Is it possible that even people in terrible circumstances could could dream, could move beyond them, could see something different? And that, again, not blaming the Israelites, but we certainly do see them in a position, described as in a position of not being able to imagine anything different. And some people, perhaps in their circumstances, could respond differently. Again, not blaming them, but yeah, Adela writes, if you're stubborn, you're stuck. But if you're stuck, you're not always stubborn, right? So I think we were trying to move away from getting bogged down by that term, to think about just more different ways of not being able to see change and what might cause that, and what could characterize that. Yeah, Lance, go ahead.
What is the difference between labeling someone stubborn and labeling someone a dirty Jew?
You tell me.
Well, it's stigmatizing. It's stereotyping. It's attempting to project onto someone um, a kind of characterization or uh, uh, classifying that really is not fair or certainly not complex or even true. These are characters. I mean, and to call them stubborn or to call them um, rebellious or to call God stubborn, something like that, is to really overlook extreme complexities. And we, in this situation, are involved in a complex world that is so complex that I would argue there are no answers to questions. There are only questions because we can't see what's going on really. I can't either. I'm not trying to suggest that I have any X-ray vision here, but it seems to me that name calling is not an appropriate method of textual criticism.
Yeah, okay, fair. It certainly is a drash, and it's certainly, again, as opposed to Paro, where we have those terms being used, she's looking at this side by sideness of, different descriptions of Bnei Israel and of Paro as needing to be convinced of something, and therefore building and developing, trying to look at what might be common between them. But I agree with you that it certainly is there's no doubt it's a characterization, and an attempt to label something that's not obvious or apparent, and there's no way to know for sure. I think that's definitely true. David?
What's the word that Rav Avital uses for stubborn?
Akshanut, I think, meaning in as the modern Hebrew word that she's using, it's akshanut. Yeah,
Yeah, I like your word stuck. I like the word determined. Um,
yeah, yeah. And it's interesting. In the last paragraph, she comes back around in the Hebrew and she uses hit akshut, which is the same root, but I think that akshanut is stubbornness, and hit akshut is a little bit more like persistence. And so there is there's a shift to a more positive, shade of it, um, there. Yeah, yeah.
well, it's so funny that you talk about MLK. It's also the week of the first step of the first phase of this deal,
Mm-hmm.
and there's so much joy and there's so much pain simultaneously.
Mm.
And what's really required is to or somebody said tonight, I hate this deal and I totally support it.
Mm-hmm.
But it requires people to break out of their prior visions.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Absolutely. Debbie?
I was thinking that instead of using the word stuck, sometimes people, when they can't move, they could be paralyzed. They could be frozen. A person might be afraid, and therefore they can't move. It could be that Bnei Israel at that point we're just either so tired. To make a change, to transition to something else takes energy. To go in a new direction takes energy. And they just didn't have it. It they just were spent. Sometimes we use the phrase, I'm working on, fumes. That's all I have left.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Bnei Israel at this point, they had put all their eggs in the basket of Moshe. And they really thought that finally, Pakod Yifkod, he would do it. And then when things got worse, they were broken. They were finished. Because they had their hopes up. As long as they're going along and nothing's changing, they can deal with it. But as soon as you have raised hopes and then they're broken, you don't go back to where you were. You go even further down. So
Yeah.
I don't know if I would use the word stubborn. I would say maybe they were paralyzed or they were spent. There are different ways of describing when you can't move anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Exhausted, finished.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe a piece of what we take away from here is to, in challenging maybe the framework is just to kind of ask the question, when we look at people who are not able to change, or not willing to change, we ask the question, what are the circumstances that are contributing to that? Why do we think that is? What kind of leadership could make that shift? And how are Paro and Bnei Israel in different circumstances? Could the same approaches work for both parties or not? In the end, in a sense, it is the same kind of might and signs of God that ultimately do convince both parties. So why is that? And we don't necessarily have those kinds of tools at our disposal. But what techniques can work for different kinds of stuck parties? Bracha?
This is totally a crazy idea. I'm wondering whether what she calls stubbornness on the part of the Jews is actually a form of resistance, even if it's against the person that's their leader. It's a flourishing of something, maybe, that they could use when they feel a little stronger.
Say a little bit more. How?
I wish I could. I don't understand it myself. Basically, I'm sort of seeing it's like almost the opposite of what you would think, that maybe this stubbornness that arises at a time of being worn down may actually be the beginning of a strength.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's currently against their current leader.
Mm-hmm.
It's where it's safe to be stubborn, because they to a certain extent, even though it hasn't worked, they trust this leader.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. It's just this isn't quite the same thing, but it makes me think about sometimes with our children, when they're really, really exhausted, and you just tell them like all you need to do right now is go to bed. And like with the last ounces of strength that they have, they resist going to bed. It's sort of like, what's that response about? And and again, it doesn't feel like Bnei Israel are quite, I guess they are displaying resistance. They're using some little modicum of strength to kind of complain back against Moshe. So there is something fascinating there. Before I come just to the my mom or dad, my dad and Lance, just take a moment to show you this essay by my colleague and friend, Rabbi Zach Truboff, called "To Be a Stiff-Necked People." It was just published yesterday, the English translation of something that he wrote in Hebrew. And he talks about the stiff-necked people quality, and in particular focuses in on teaching of the Eish Kodesh, the Piazetzner Rebbe, Rav Kalanimus Kalmish Shapiro, who he understands to kind of be a model of, you know, of toughness in a sense, and the toughness to tell it like it is, and not kind of take pat answers, as he was, in the Warsaw Ghetto in a terrible, terrible time. And he talks about the stiff-necked quality of the Jewish people. He writes that for the Piazetzner Rebbe, the greatness of the Jewish people is also the cause of our failures. We are a stiff-necked people. He explains that this expression is of profound importance in grasping the uniqueness of the Jewish people and explores its meaning by examining the debate between God and Moshe after the sin of the golden calf. Right after the sin of the golden calf, God wants to destroy the Jews. And God says, I'm not going to even send an emissary of my presence to be with you. Lo bechem kiam kashe oref, because you are a stiff-necked people. And then Moshe responds a little bit later and says, no, you should forgive the Jews because they are a stiff-necked people, right? Please, God, go among us, um, because we are a stiff-necked people, and forgive our iniquity and sin and take us as your own. So he says, the Piazetzner Rebbe asks, and how could the cause of the sin, the reason God doesn't want to go among us is because we're stiff-necked? And the argument that Moshe makes is you should be among us because we're stiff-necked. How could the cause of the sin also be the reason God should forgive them for it? And he writes, being stiff-necked is one of the most positive of attributes. One who is not stiff-necked flips back and forth. One time they hold like this, and another they hold differently. This is a translation of the Piazetzner Rebbe's Eish Kodesh on Noach.
They stubbornly.
Exactly. Yes, it's not possible to come to a final decision with them. Now they may want to serve God. Now they may want to serve God, but at a later time they can be a different person, especially when they are put to the test. They may not be able to endure, God forbid. This is not the case for one who is stiff-necked. This person is straight, when you speak with and work on them. When they decide to serve God, you can trust they will do it. In fact, the more one is stiff-necked, the better one will be able to withstand difficulty. Being a stiff-necked people is only a terrible thing when the attribute is used for evil, and one becomes stubborn about evil matters. And he goes on to develop this in a few other different ways, including analyzing an agadic passage. And he concludes, if the Jews are in some way able to be God's representatives in the world, it is because they do not change and they do not submit. As God says about God's own self, I, God, do not change. The world constantly changes. Nothing ever remains the same, but somehow after everything, the Jews are still here. The meaning of this holds great importance. Remember, this is a rabbi teaching his, followers in the Warsaw Ghetto. Since the beginning of the war, I have frequently heard the slogan, "Together we will be victorious." This is now, hold on a second. This, I think, is now back to Rabbi Zach Truboff. I have frequently heard the slogan, "Together we will be victorious." Everyone knows that our enemies cannot be defeated if we are divided. But we have to understand that unity in a moment such as this is not something unique to the Jews. Every nation becomes unified in a time of war. For when a nation is threatened, people always rally around the flag. What we must remember is that the Jews are not meant to be like all other nations, and therefore our victory is different from theirs. It comes not from an impulse for unity, but rather from being a stiff-necked people. We are a people chosen by the God who says, I, God, do not change. And as the verse concludes, you, the children of Jacob, will not come to an end. We call ourselves Am HaNetzach, the everlasting people, not because we're stronger than other nations, for historically, we do not defeat our enemies with a gun or a fist on the battlefield. We defeat them because we find a way to remain, even when others think this cannot be done. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Romans are no longer here. The Jews remain. Why? Because we are a stiff-necked people, the children of Abraham. And even if the entire world stands on one side, Abraham and his children will find a way to remain on the other. So just a kind of another take on the virtues of stiff-neckedness as a quality, which perhaps what maybe ties back to what Bracha was saying, maybe the very, very beginning of our resistance to hear the message of our redemption was actually the beginning of developing our stiff-necked quality, which again has a bad side when used for evil, but serves us in good stead in difficult times. Dad, were you going to comment? Dad and Mom?
Yes, I was just thinking about the Israelites as slaves in Egypt, and the Israelites as we can call them free people in the desert. It seems to me that in the desert they're still complaining. They're thirsty, they're hungry. The food in Egypt was better. It's almost as if that quality of dissatisfaction, um, that generation has to go away,
Hmm,
and they can't go into the land. It's it's too much to ask of them, something like that.
interesting. Great.
I do think also that that's a continuation of working towards freedom, that ability to complain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The ability to complain. Yep. Yep. All right, back to Lance for what might be the last word.
Well, Bracha brought up the word resistance. And as we know, Hamas thinks of themselves as resistance, not as terrorists. However, the point I want to make is what happened on October 7th, 1944. Do you remember that?
Tell me.
Okay. On October 7th, 1944, in Auschwitz, the Sonder commandos rebelled and they destroyed Crematorium 4, thanks to three women who transferred gunpowder from Birkenau to Auschwitz. And the point there is that the days of Jews as victims are over. Today, in the state of Israel, we defend ourselves. And I might suggest, very outrageously, that if you have a ceasefire with the enemy, you lose. If the enemy surrenders, you win.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so we got to see a lot. I think a fascinating essay again with, as a reading of the parasha or a theme of the parasha. It started off with that comparison between that lining up side by side of Bnei Israel and Paro, of both needing to hear the message of redemption, building off of the Rosh Shimshon Raphael Hirsch with the kind of three qualities of stubbornness, resistance, inability slash unwillingness to move, which again I think are interesting to think about in our own lives. Those three different kind of the imperviousness to outside influence, the letting it in but not allowing ourselves to be impacted by it, and then the sort of letting it in, allowing ourselves to be impacted by it, and yet still refusing kind of defiantly to respond in kind. Um, and then the development of the parallel to Bnei Israel, and then the character of God as the kind of the out stubborner of the stubborn. And I think our kind of collective reflections that maybe stubbornness wasn't a good enough term to describe all three, but stuckness or inability or unwillingness to change is sort of the theme, and thinking about how does it is it best met with the same kind of thing, or is there a different quality that's needed to respond to it? How does it depend on what the root causes of the um, challenge in changing is? And then that little meditation on the stiff-neckedness as a quality of the Jews from the Piazetzner Rebbe and the Eish Kodesh, and we continue on forward through the book. So. Thanks, everybody. Great rest of the week. Next week, we should be back to our usual Monday day. Up to
Thank
mom
you.
and dad. Good night to all.